Have you ever felt like God was asking you to do something that seemed completely wrong according to everything you'd been taught? Maybe you've experienced that uncomfortable tension where your heart is pulling you in one direction, but the rules, the traditions, even the people around you are saying something entirely different. You're not alone in this struggle, and what might surprise you is that sometimes God actually wants you to break the rules. A.W. Tozer understood this spiritual reality better than most. Throughout his life, he witnessed how religious systems could become barriers to genuine encounters with God. He saw how well-meaning traditions could actually prevent people from experiencing the authentic relationship with the divine that their souls desperately craved. Tozer taught that there's a profound difference between obeying God and obeying religious expectations, and sometimes these two paths lead in completely opposite directions. Think about it for a moment. When was the last time you felt truly alive in your relationship with God? Not just going through the motions, not just following the prescribed formula, but genuinely encountering the living God who knows you intimately and loves you unconditionally. If you're like most people, you might realize it's been longer than you'd like to admit. That's because we've been taught to focus on external compliance rather than internal transformation, on rule following rather than relationship building. Today, we're going to explore 5 specific moments when disobedience to human systems actually represents perfect obedience to God. These aren't moments of rebellion for rebellion's sake, but rather instances where the Holy Spirit calls us to step outside comfortable boundaries in order to step into God's perfect will. We'll discover how to recognize these divine invitations and find the courage to respond, even when it makes others uncomfortable. This isn't about becoming a spiritual rebel or dismissing all authority. Rather, it's about developing the kind of intimate relationship with God that A.W. Tozer wrote about, where you can discern his voice so clearly that you're willing to follow him even when it means disappointing others. It's about understanding that sometimes the most obedient thing you can do is disobey. The religious landscape of Tozer's time was filled with the same challenges we face today. Churches had become comfortable with routine. Spiritual leaders had grown satisfied with maintaining systems rather than pursuing God. And ordinary believers had settled for a second-hand faith rather than seeking their own authentic encounters with the divine. Sound familiar? Tozer saw how this religious complacency was actually preventing people from experiencing the transformative power of genuine relationship with God. In his writings, Tozer consistently emphasized that God is not confined to our human systems, no matter how well-intentioned they might be. He understood that the moment we create rigid structures around our faith, we risk missing the dynamic, living presence of God, who often moves in ways that surprise us. This doesn't mean that structure and tradition are always wrong, but rather that they should never become more important than the relationship they're meant to facilitate. Consider the state of spiritual life in our current culture. We have more Christian resources, more church programs, more religious content than any generation in history. Yet surveys consistently show that people are experiencing less genuine spiritual satisfaction than ever before. Why? Because we've created elaborate systems that can actually function quite well without the presence of God. We've become so skilled at religious performance that we've forgotten what it feels like to be genuinely transformed by an encounter with the living God. This is exactly what Tozer warned against. He saw how easy it is to substitute religious activity for spiritual reality, how comfortable it becomes to follow human rules rather than pursue divine relationship. He understood that sometimes God calls us to break free from these comfortable constraints in order to discover what He's actually doing in our lives and in our world. The problem is that most of us have been conditioned to equate spiritual maturity with rule following. We've been taught that good Christians always comply, always submit, always go along with established patterns. But what if this very mindset is preventing us from experiencing the adventures that God has in store for us? What if our commitment to religious correctness is actually a form of spiritual timidity that keeps us from the bold faith that God desires to develop in us? Tozer believed that authentic spiritual life requires courage, the willingness to risk misunderstanding and even criticism in order to follow God's leading. He saw that those who impact the world for God are often those who are willing to step outside conventional boundaries when the Spirit calls them to do so. This doesn't mean being irresponsible or rebellious, but rather being so attuned to God's voice that you're willing to trust Him even when His direction seems unconventional. The beauty of this approach to faith is that it leads to genuine spiritual adventure. Instead of spiritual life being a series of obligations and restrictions, it becomes a dynamic relationship where God can surprise you, challenge you, and use you in ways you never expected. This is the kind of faith that Tozer both practiced and advocated, a faith that's alive with possibility because it's anchored in relationship rather than rules. This brings us to the heart of what we need to understand about godly disobedience. There are specific moments when God calls us to break human rules in order to fulfill divine purposes. These moments test our spiritual maturity because they require us to distinguish between God's voice and human expectations. They demand that we trust our relationship with God more than our reputation with people. The first moment when disobedience becomes God's will is when religious traditions begin to hinder genuine worship and authentic relationship with God. Tozer saw this pattern repeatedly throughout his ministry. He watched as churches became more concerned with maintaining their traditions than with facilitating encounters with the living God. He observed how worship services could become elaborate performances that actually prevented people from experiencing the transformative presence of God. Think about the religious leaders of Jesus' time. They had created an incredibly detailed system of rules and regulations that they believed honored God. These weren't bad people with malicious intentions. They were sincere individuals who genuinely wanted to serve God faithfully. Yet Jesus consistently challenged their approach because their system had become more important than the relationship it was meant to foster. This same dynamic happens today. We create worship formats, church structures, and spiritual practices that can actually function quite well without the presence of God. We become so focused on doing things correctly that we forget to ask whether we're actually encountering God in the process. When this happens, God sometimes calls us to break free from these comfortable patterns in order to rediscover what authentic spiritual life actually looks like. Consider how this might play out in your own spiritual journey. Maybe you've been faithfully attending church services, participating in religious activities, and following spiritual disciplines, but you've begun to realize that these practices have become empty routines rather than means of connecting with God. The temptation is to continue with these familiar patterns because they're safe and socially acceptable. But what if God is calling you to step outside these comfortable boundaries in order to discover fresh ways of connecting with Him? This doesn't mean abandoning faith or rejecting all structure. Rather, it means being willing to let God reshape your spiritual practices when they've become barriers rather than bridges to genuine relationship with Him. It means having the courage to admit when familiar religious activities have lost their power to transform your heart and being open to new ways that God might want to work in your life. The second moment when disobedience becomes God's will is when human authority figures, even well-meaning ones, attempt to limit what God wants to do in your life. This is perhaps one of the most challenging situations because it involves disappointing people who care about you and whom you respect. Yet Tozer understood that there are times when loyalty to God requires us to disappoint human authorities, even when those authorities are operating from good intentions. Throughout biblical history, we see this pattern repeated. Moses had to disobey Pharaoh's commands in order to lead God's people to freedom. The Hebrew midwives disobeyed the king's orders to kill male babies because they feared God more than they feared human authority. The apostles declared that they must obey God rather than men when religious leaders commanded them to stop preaching about Jesus. In each of these cases, the individuals involved weren't being rebellious or disrespectful for its own sake. They were being faithful to a higher authority when human authorities were asking them to compromise their relationship with God. They understood that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is to respectfully disobey human commands that conflict with divine purposes. This dynamic still occurs today. Maybe you've experienced a situation where parents, church leaders, or other authority figures have tried to discourage you from pursuing what you believe God is calling you to do. Perhaps they've suggested that your sense of calling is unrealistic, inappropriate, or potentially dangerous. Their concerns might be genuine and their intentions pure, But what if God is actually calling you to step outside their comfort zones in order to fulfill His purposes for your life? Tozer would remind us that God often calls people to do things that seem risky or unconventional to others. He understood that divine callings rarely fit neatly into human categories or expectations. When God calls someone to serve in a particular way, that calling often requires courage to move beyond the boundaries that others have set for them. The key is learning to distinguish between wise counsel that should be heeded and human limitations that should be transcended. This requires developing the kind of intimate relationship with God that Tozer advocated, where you can discern His voice with enough clarity to follow Him, even when others don't understand. It means being humble enough to receive input from others, while being confident enough in your relationship with God to ultimately follow His leading. The third moment when disobedience becomes God's will is when social expectations conflict with opportunities to demonstrate God's love and acceptance. Tozer understood that religious communities often develop unspoken rules about who belongs and who doesn't, who's acceptable and who isn't. These social boundaries can become so entrenched that they actually prevent God's people from fulfilling their calling to be agents of His love and redemption in the world. Jesus consistently violated these social expectations throughout His ministry. He ate with tax collectors and sinners, spoke with Samaritan women, touched lepers, and welcomed children when His disciples tried to send them away. In each case, He was breaking social rules in order to demonstrate God's heart for people who had been excluded or marginalized by religious society. This pattern continues today. There are still unspoken rules in many religious communities about who fits and who doesn't, who's welcome and who isn't. These boundaries might be based on economic status, lifestyle choices, past mistakes, or simply differences in personality or background. When these social expectations prevent us from extending God's love to people who need it, we're called to disobey these human boundaries in order to fulfill divine purposes. Think about your own community and the subtle ways that certain people might be excluded or made to feel unwelcome. Maybe there are individuals whose backgrounds, appearances, or life situations make others uncomfortable. Maybe there are people who've made mistakes or poor choices that have led to their being quietly marginalized. What if God is calling you to break through these social barriers in order to demonstrate His unconditional love and acceptance? This kind of disobedience requires courage, because it often means risking social disapproval or criticism. People might question your judgment, wonder about your motives, or even suggest that you're being naive or irresponsible. But Tozer understood that God's love is often most powerfully demonstrated when His people are willing to cross social boundaries that others consider inappropriate or uncomfortable. The fourth moment when disobedience becomes God's will is when personal comfort and security must be sacrificed for the sake of spiritual growth and service. Tozer believed that spiritual maturity requires a willingness to step outside familiar boundaries and comfort zones when God calls us to do so. He understood that God often uses uncomfortable situations to develop character, faith, and dependence on Him. This is perhaps the most personal form of godly disobedience, because it involves breaking your own rules rather than external expectations. It means disobeying your natural instincts for safety and comfort when God calls you to take risks for His kingdom. It requires saying no to your own desires for predictability and control when God invites you into adventures that require faith and courage. Consider how this might apply to your own spiritual journey. Maybe you've become comfortable with a certain level of spiritual commitment that doesn't really challenge you or require much sacrifice. Maybe you've created boundaries around your faith that keep God at a safe distance rather than allowing Him to transform you in ways that might be uncomfortable or demanding. What if God is calling you to break through these self-imposed limitations in order to experience the fullness of what He has in store for you? This could involve stepping into leadership roles that intimidate you, pursuing callings that seem beyond your capabilities, or making sacrifices that require genuine faith rather than just good intentions. It might mean leaving familiar situations or comfortable relationships in order to follow God's leading into unknown territory. These moments test whether you're willing to trust God enough to disobey your own instincts for self-preservation. Tozer would remind us that spiritual growth always requires some level of risk and discomfort. He understood that God doesn't call us to spiritual adventures because they're easy or safe, but because they're necessary for our development and His purposes. When we choose comfort over calling, we actually disobey God's intention for our lives, even though we might appear to be playing it safe. The fifth moment when disobedience becomes God's will is when religious performance begins to substitute for genuine spiritual transformation. This is perhaps the most subtle form of godly disobedience, because it involves breaking free from patterns that appear to be spiritual, but have actually become barriers to authentic relationship with God. Tozer saw this pattern frequently in his ministry. He watched as people became skilled at religious performance without experiencing genuine spiritual transformation. They could participate in worship services, quote scripture, and engage in spiritual disciplines without their hearts being truly changed by encounters with God. Their external compliance with religious expectations actually prevented them from experiencing the internal transformation that God desired for them. When this happens, God sometimes calls us to disobey these familiar religious patterns in order to rediscover what authentic spiritual life actually looks like. This might mean stepping away from certain activities or practices that have become mere routine, rather than means of connecting with God. It might involve admitting that your spiritual life has become more about appearance than reality, more about performance than transformation. This form of disobedience requires brutal honesty about the actual state of your spiritual life. It means being willing to acknowledge when familiar religious activities have lost their power to change your heart, and being open to new ways that God might want to work in your life. It requires the courage to disappoint others who might be impressed by your religious performance while being honest about your need for authentic spiritual transformation. So how do we practically apply these principles in our daily lives? The key is developing the kind of intimate relationship with God that allows us to discern His voice clearly and respond courageously when He calls us to step outside conventional boundaries. This requires cultivating what Tozer called the inner life, the secret place where we meet with God and learn to recognize His presence and leading. First, we must become skilled at distinguishing between God's voice and human expectations. This requires regular time in prayer and meditation, not just asking God for things, but actually listening for His guidance and direction. It means learning to recognize the difference between fear-based decisions and faith-based ones, between choices that protect our reputation and choices that honor God's calling. Second, we need to develop the courage to follow God's leading even when it makes others uncomfortable. This doesn't mean being reckless or disrespectful, but rather being confident enough in our relationship with God to trust Him when His direction seems unconventional. It means learning to value God's approval more than human approval, even when human disapproval is painful. Third, we must be willing to examine our own motives and ensure that our disobedience is actually motivated by desire to honor God, rather than desire to rebel against authority. True godly disobedience is never motivated by pride, anger, or desire for attention. It's always motivated by love for God and desire to fulfill His purposes, even when that fulfillment requires stepping outside comfortable boundaries. Fourth, we need to cultivate wisdom about timing and approach. God's calling to disobey human expectations doesn't give us license to be unnecessarily harsh or disrespectful. We can often follow God's leading while still honoring the people we might disappoint. This requires prayer, wisdom, and often consultation with trusted advisors who can help us discern both God's will and the best way to respond to it. Finally, we must be prepared for the consequences of godly disobedience. Following God's leading often involves sacrifice, misunderstanding, and sometimes even persecution. Tozer understood that authentic spiritual life requires courage because it often puts us at odds with human expectations and systems. But he also understood that the rewards of authentic relationship with God far outweigh the costs of religious conformity. When we learn to recognize and respond to these moments of godly disobedience, we discover that spiritual life becomes an adventure rather than a burden. Instead of being confined by human expectations and limitations, we become free to participate in God's purposes in ways that surprise and delight us. We find that God can use us in ways we never expected because we're willing to trust Him enough to step outside our comfort zones. This doesn't mean that every impulse to disobey is from God. Wisdom requires learning to distinguish between divine calling and human rebellion, between spirit-led risk-taking and flesh-driven recklessness. But it does mean that we should be open to the possibility that God might call us to break human rules in order to fulfill divine purposes. The ultimate test of whether our disobedience is godly is whether it produces spiritual fruit in our lives and in the lives of others. Godly disobedience leads to increased love, joy, peace, and effectiveness in service. It results in deeper relationship with God and greater impact for His kingdom. It produces the kind of spiritual maturity that Tozer advocated throughout his ministry. As we conclude this exploration of godly disobedience, remember that this isn't a call to become spiritually rebellious or disrespectful. Rather, it's an invitation to develop the kind of intimate relationship with God that allows you to follow His leading even when it seems unconventional. It's a challenge to examine your own spiritual life and ask whether you've become so comfortable with religious conformity that you've lost the capacity for spiritual adventure. God is not confined to human systems, no matter how well-intentioned they might be. He's not limited by our expectations or traditions. He's a living God who desires dynamic relationship with His people. And sometimes that relationship requires us to step outside familiar boundaries in order to discover what He's actually doing in our lives and in our world. The question isn't whether you'll ever face moments when God calls you to disobey human expectations. The question is whether you'll have the spiritual maturity to recognize these moments and the courage to respond faithfully when they occur. Will you be so attuned to God's voice that you can follow Him even when His direction seems unconventional? Will you value your relationship with Him more than your reputation with others? These are the questions that separate those who merely follow religious rules from those who actually follow God. They're the questions that determine whether your spiritual life becomes a transformative adventure or a comfortable routine. They're the questions that Tozer spent his life helping people answer. And they're the questions that will determine the depth and authenticity of your own relationship with God. The beautiful truth is that God is inviting you into this kind of dynamic relationship with Him right now. He's not asking you to become a spiritual rebel or to reject all authority. He's asking you to trust Him enough to follow His leading, even when it requires stepping outside conventional boundaries. He's inviting you to discover what authentic spiritual life looks like when it's anchored in relationship rather than rules. This is the adventure that awaits those who are willing to say yes to God's calling, even when that calling seems to contradict human expectations. It's the journey that leads to genuine spiritual transformation and effectiveness in service. It's the path that Tozer both walked and advocated, and it's the path that leads to the kind of authentic relationship with God that your heart truly desires. The choice is yours. Will you remain safely within the boundaries of religious conformity? Or will you trust God enough to follow Him when He calls you to break the rules? Will you settle for second-hand spiritual experiences? Or will you pursue the kind of authentic relationship with God that sometimes requires godly disobedience? The answer to these questions will determine not just the shape of your spiritual life, but the depth of your relationship with a God who loves you enough to call you beyond your comfortable boundaries into the adventure of genuine faith.